Now introduce Max Liboiron to you today. It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce Max to you today. And some drilling just started where I am, so I don't know if you're going to hear that. But Max holds an MFA in art from Stony Brook, and we first met at the exhibition This Is For Real, War and the Contemporary Audience, which was at the SAC Gallery in 2004. Some of Max's work was shown in that exhibit, and they also participated in a panel discussion about how art might best respond to war. In that initial encounter, I was immediately struck by Max's ability to not only do art that was original and captivating, but also to articulate the theories and methods that motivated that doing. During their time at Stony Brook, Max took a graduate seminar with me, a precursor of sorts to the seminar that they're joining today. One of our tasks in the seminar was to explore the relationship between theory and method, especially within the context of doing interdisciplinary research. That semester, Max presented as part of the MFA thesis exhibition, and they gave the class a tour of their work, which looked at the relationship between human actions and the devastation of environments, including the diverse environments of Fire Island, New York, and the Canadian Arctic. Max's final paper for the class, which was titled On Hybridity in Science, continued to explore environment as a multiple object. Their essay was a brilliantly argued and beautifully written, you'll not be surprised, analysis of a research project on climate change in Sax Harbor, Canada. Max looked at how elders of a First Nation community contributed to the conceptualization and enactment of that study. Max described hybridity not in terms of beingness or beings, ontology, but practices as a kind of methodology. As you can tell, although some of the language has changed, Max already as an MFA student was foregrounding obligation to land, capital L and small l, as the primary frame for art and science. From Stony Brook, Max would go to NYU to do their doctorate in media studies. Their academic trajectory from fine arts to media to leader in developing and promoting anti-colonial research methods into a wide array of disciplines and spaces is unique. And for me, and I know many others, it's exciting to see this in action in Pollution is Colonialism. Max is founder of the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research, CLEAR, a land-based feminist and anti-colonial environmental science lab. As Max writes, CLEAR is a marine laboratory that is well ensconced in dominant and Western science, while also conducting anti-colonial science. Max has influenced national policy on both plastics and Indigenous research, invented technologies and protocols for community monitoring of plastics, and led the development of the interdisciplinary field of discard studies. Pollution is Colonialism bridges science and technology studies, Indigenous studies, and discard studies, while providing a framework for understanding all research methods as practices that align with or against colonialism. Focusing on plastic pollution, the text models an anti-colonial scientific practice associated with Métis concepts of land, ethics, and relations, and demonstrates that anti-colonial science is not only possible, but is currently being practiced. As Max writes, these are not theoretical questions. They are practical questions, questions of method and ethics, hyphenated because they are the same thing. Critique is important, but it can only take you so far when you are a practitioner trying to do work in a good way, end quote. When Max was a student in my graduate seminar way back when, Anna Marie Moll visited the class to discuss her groundbreaking work, The Body Multiple. There are many interventions in The Body Multiple, but I just want to mention one which relates to writing better. Moll pays attention to writing itself, because she believes that we need to enrich, complexify, and change academic writing practices by taking our writing methods as seriously as our methods of gathering and analyzing materials. And she mentions this one book that has a sort of very unsexy title, Health and Efficiency. And she says that this book brims with conversation, shifts in scenery, alternative presentations of material, self-reflexive remarks, and jokes. To me, this sentence could also describe pollution as colonialism. There aren't very many scholarly books that I've read that frequently make me smile and sometimes laugh and also feel angry as I'm reading. Yet even in its humor, this is a serious book about how to do science in an anti-colonial way. Max is Associate Professor in Geography at Memorial University in Newfoundland, Canada. We're going to have a very short presentation from Max, and then we'll have questions from students in my class. And please use the chat for other visitors. Please use the chat, put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. So Max, are you ready to go?
I'm ready. Thank you so very, very much for that introduction and your uncanny memory. I remember less than 2% of everything you described. I remember Fire Island. I don't even remember the War Art Show or the paper you're talking about, or yeah.
So I had a letter that I could go back to and look at. Yeah,
it's true. Yeah. And I have a photograph of me, you, Lisa, Krista Erickson, wearing 2014 style clothing that maybe we don't want to get brought up, but on Fire Island. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes. So thank you for the humbling introduction in more ways than one. The exciting invitation. I mean, it's mind-blowing enough to write a book, period. That someone actually reads it is staggering, or assigns it to their class seems very unlikely. And for something like this to happen, where a professor who introduced me to feminist STS, invites me, and I have my former thesis advisor in the crowd, and like this just is well, it's a sincere thank you, because this is going to be very cool. So thank you for the invitation and for the legacies. So yeah, quick 10-minute presentation for those who didn't do the reading. I strongly believe in making space for people who didn't do the reading. And then we'll get to basically a bunch of questions from Lisa's grad students, which I'm pumped about. So I'm going to start with the origins of this book, retroactively how I understand them, a little bit about the main arguments, and then sort of this format thing. So the book comes out of two intersecting moments in my thinking life, my career trajectory. The first is that during my dissertation, marine plastics were just beginning to be articulated as a scientific problem, not even an environmental problem yet, just a scientific one. Like, what is this? And as I was researching it, I became convinced that there was going to be a paradigm shift, this like famous paradigm shift situation, because plastics pollute so very, very differently than anything else. They don't assimilate into the environment. When they do break down into smaller microplastics and nanoplastics, they pollute differently and more dangerously. The chemicals associated with them, endocrine disrupting compounds, cause the greatest harm at the lowest doses, which flies in the face of the toxicological axiom that the danger's in the dose. They both support and harm life simultaneously. And I really thought there'd be a paradigm shift, and there really, really wasn't. And so I didn't understand that for a long time. And then secondly, and a little bit later, I came here to Newfoundland and Labrador, the Baltic homelands, to take up a job and critique the plastic pollution science a la feminist STS, but there was no science to critique. There'd been a anti-environmental government for 8 years, and there was no science. And so I ended up taking up the job of what's called undone science in STS, science that is conspicuously not performed. But I wanted to not be a jerk when I did the science. So I mean, feminist STS is founded on like, whoa, super macho, kind of individualistic, a little bit sexist, kind of racist. Mastery over nature, we have some problems here, and I was about to take up the mantle, right? So this intersection happened where I came to understand these two problems being not only about power dynamics in general, but colonialism in particular was really useful. This mastery over nature, this leading with your desires into the blank space sort of, and yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about some of that in a moment. So the book does a few different things. This is a Post-it note that is still like right there on my computer, although there's another Post-it over it now. This is one of the first reviewers of the draft of my book, Joe Masco. He basically gave me this Post-it note list. The book does 4 things. So if you're a reviewer, telling the author the 4 things their book does is super helpful. First of all, it's a methods text, which Lisa did allude to. It argues that methodology is a way of being in the world and thus an ethics. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a scientist studying plastic or an author building a book or a student reading a book or someone citing things or, you know, walking down the street. There are going to be methodological choices, being in the world choices at every moment that align with or against colonial land relations, which are the norm. And so the book tries to make those really apparent. And one of the things it tries to make that really apparent in is pollution. So the definition of pollution of colonialism, pollution isn't the byproduct of colonialism, but its achievement, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then it uses, in the last part, it uses plastics to refuse and refute the colonial, meaning that plastics and pollution aren't inherently colonial. They don't have to be. Those relations aren't settled forever and ever. But you can, because plastics are made of, you know, great-great-great-great-grandparent dinosaurs that have been coerced into certain forms, you can bring them into other land relations. And then the last point is you can also do that in science, in dominant science, that would normally be colonial, but doesn't have to be. It just usually is. And so how do you do that otherwise? And that's the last part of the book, part I often call dessert chapter, the last chapter. So one of the first things the book does in the introduction is it really sets up that a method of specificity is crucial for activism or interventions. And interventions include thinking, reading, right? Those sorts of things. And so it differentiates between colonialism and capitalism, anti-colonialism and environmentalism, which often get conflated. And while those things can overlap, they're not synonymous, right? So there are instances in history where capitalism was going to disrupt the colony, and so they switched to a different economic system, for instance. Environmentalism, mainstream environmentalism, things like building hydroelectric dams, renewable energy in this province, in Innu land, and then putting methyl mercury into food webs, which is what hydroelectric dams do, or appeals to the commons, which rely on broad access to Indigenous stolen land, right? These sorts of things might be environmental goods, but they're also colonial bads, or if you're a colonist, colonial goods. So the being careful not to conflate bads and not to conflate goods if you want to take specific actions that actually addresses certain power dynamics. And so the working definition of colonialism in the book, and there are many, many colonialisms out there. This isn't a universal definition, but it works pretty well in settler colonialism, like Canada and the United States. And that's land theft and genocide so that non-Indigenous people, groups, institutions can have access to Indigenous land for non-Indigenous goals, including benevolent ones like renewable energy or commons or these sorts of things. And the first example, or the core example that it takes, is environmental regulation that a lot of environmental activism rallies around. And it's this, so right now the modern paradigm of environmental pollution regulation worldwide, starting in the States, but worldwide now, is this idea that there's a moment where harm occurs when you introduce a contaminant. So, you know, like you can have 0.91 micrograms of arsenic per liter of water or something like that. But bodies of water, landscapes, human bodies, animal bodies, they can take a little bit of a contaminant before harm occurs, but you don't want there to be too much, because then they're poisoned or harmed or something. So science becomes about locating that threshold, and regulation becomes regulating that threshold. And the whole time you're assuming access to Indigenous land and life to put that little bit of toxicant in to be absorbed. So that's one of the primary examples of something that seems very benign and normal and even good in some environmental circles, but is completely premised on colonial land relations. But also the book talks about how that's also true for like reading and writing and citing and things that also seem very benign. And the place that most people notice this is in the footnotes. So this is the first footnote from the first chapter, which is not the first footnote because they're in the acknowledgements, which is its own little chapter. And so in some ways, I think about this book as an art project. I do have 2 art degrees, and one of them comes from Stony Brook. And what I like about art is that it really takes this idea that if the argument you're making isn't also being made by the form or the medium, then you're probably lying, right? So having the book and the form of the book also make this argument about responsibility and obligations and being in good land relations and everything you do gets taken up in the footnote, in part in the footnotes, sometimes to pull people up, certain audiences in for a private conversation like Indigenous youth, or hey, white reader, I bet you, right? This sort of stuff to have these conversations where the jokes happen to like give some breathing room for difficult concepts, Canadian spellings to remind people that this book comes from a very specific place and will not universalize. So the goal of this sort of formatting is that the readers feel and witness the argument as well as read the argument overtly on the page. So these are some of the ways that like my training in art still show up, even though I am now, according to my resume, a capital scientist. So thank you again for coming, for making this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Max. You anticipated some of them, but we'll start and maybe there'll be some questions to go into more detail, especially this first one about citation. Callan, and I'm still getting a drill. I don't know if you all are hearing it. I hope not. But Callan has our first question. Callan, you want to unmute? So students, you should be able to unmute yourselves. And come on.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much for your work. I think that you'll see from the questions that it's brought up so much for a lot of us. And so I want to thank you for being here today and for everything that you put into the text. My question is definitely about methodology. So I was thinking about the really extensive and long footnotes and all the jokes, which really complicate like any ability to read the book in sort of a linear way and complicate any like singular narrative. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about this methodology, like what it means to you and how this as a method might enact like good relations between multiple readers of your text.
Sure. So one of the things that is true for Michif or Métis, Red River Métis folks, which is my nation, is that to like make declarations about what the world is like is not the job of young people, it's the job of elders. It's not true of all groups or nations, but it is where I'm from. And so the job of an academic is super cheeky and really rude, actually. So what I need to get stability and promotion is like also very rude where I'm from. And so trying to hold those both together, which is sort of one of the core, I mean, I think my main research question in life might be like, how the fuck do I do this, given that everything is a little fucked up, in as good a way as possible, right? So trying to make it so that the monologue of a book gets interrupted as much as possible was part of that sort of impulse. Showing my math, right? Like leaving a lot of stuff on the page, especially mistakes or me figuring things out, especially for younger or emerging scholars and thinkers. And really trying to like build a textual sculpture to literally show the shoulders I stand on. Like this doesn't come out of my head. I feel like there's very little that's really original in the book. And it's mostly just putting things together that have already been said, paraphrasing things that some folks have known for millennia, or, the last 10 minutes, that, it's trying to put them together on the page in such a way where it's obvious that this isn't me. Yeah, so that's part of that. And then the more the footnotes started running away, the more I was like, well, I'm going to put that down there too. And also they're going to do this. And like, they just started becoming very elastic out of that initial premise.
That's great. Thank you, Max, and thank you, Callan. And I just want to say one of my favorite, I mean, so you basically just said academics are rude. And that's, I mean, that's really interesting.
I mean, I think you can say that in a lot of different ways, but from where I'm from, yeah, they're like just our jobs is a very rude job.
Yeah, and I actually love how you say it. This is rude, or this is creepy is another one of your words that you use a lot, which is, I think, really interesting because there is some creepiness, right, about how people use things. And I think you really point that out well in the footnotes. Okay, next question comes from Roya. You want to unmute yourself, Roya? And this is on specificity as method.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Dr. Liboiron. Could you please tell us more about how to use specificity as a method? As you just said, the method of specificity is crucial. And I was very fascinated by your argument that differentiation and specificity matter to ensure that actions address problems and the conflation of colonialism and with other years ensure the erasure of horizons of meaningful action on page 15. The dilemmas of conflating different terminologies of issues and then downplaying the seriousness and the complexity of those problems are pretty common. So how do we use specificity as a methodology of nuanced connection and humility on page 22 to situate differences that matter to political action in other fields encountering a similar dilemma? And another question might be how specific we, especially scholars in the humanities interested in specificity or particularity, should be when attending to specific cultural contexts or selected cases. Thank you.
Yes, that was a lot. And thank you for using page numbers. That's super awesome. So I think that not the impulse towards specificity, but the obligation for specificity comes out of maybe two places for me. They'll come out of different places for other folks. One is like the problem with pan-indigeneity, which doesn't exist, as a way to like erase and fetishize folks and really screw things up, really quite badly. So I'm not going to get that into too much detail, but like Indigenous groups aren't the same. Indigenous people within the same groups, but who live in different communities aren't the same. And that becomes really painfully obvious when you travel or relocate or, you know, something like that. And so that lesson was definitely in my bones when I started writing. And that place-based knowledge is like, comes really out of a place. And so like, there's certain things I know about bogs where I come from, and there are bogs here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they are not the same bogs. And my dog's nearly drowned in a bog here because I was using the wrong lessons from the wrong bogs, right? Like, so these sorts of things are very obvious in practice, I think, in certain ways. In academia, I think the best example of the world's worst lesson on specificity, or best lesson, maybe worst use of it, is like the word decolonization. Because what the hell does that even mean anymore? As far as I can tell, it means white people getting good careers, regardless of what it used to mean in the past. So, and Tuck and Yang's decolonization, not a metaphor, makes this point. Like when you say including people on your Indigenous people on your syllabus is decolonization, and you conflate inclusion with decolonization, then genocide just gets to keep rocking along, and land relations just keep, you know, the land grab university gets to keep grabbing, and people get rewarded for having better syllabi. So how do all those things happen together? Because you've lost your specificity, and that is a political move. They call it a settler move to innocence, right? So that's a glaring academic lesson that isn't going away. It keeps rearing its head in various ways. So yeah, so I feel like whenever you're doing any research, you have to start from where it is. You can't start with theory because there's no such thing as theory without practice. You have to start with what is often called a case study, because a case study has to happen in a place, and you have to start with a place. And the place will be what what corrects you and what nuances your theory and is the theory, right? The theory and practice, I don't think, are different things. I mean, so you have to start in a place, otherwise you're lying about getting your theory from somewhere, because it's coming from somewhere. And if you erase that, you're the scientist that Donna Haraway complains about, the view from nowhere scientist. So that would, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That was fantastic, Max. Thank you so much. Wow.
Decolonization makes me so angry. Now when I hear it, I just get so angry. Doesn't matter who's saying it. And if you go into community and try and use that word, they're like, you're silly. I'm like,
yeah,
you're right.
And I think, I mean, just also this kind of white people getting good careers. I mean, the way that people use these and take up, and I mean, this kind of relates to many of your points about extractive practices, right? That I think we'll get to a little bit more as well. Wow, yes, thank you for that. Okay, and I see some folks have put some stuff in the chat, so feel free. I do want this to, we do have a plan here and people have prepared questions, but we also want people to feel they can throw comments or questions in the chat. So I know we have a lot of visitors, and I mean, we want you to enjoy this conversation, and you can sit back and just enjoy it, but also you can put stuff in the chat if you want to do that. Just want to remind everybody that. Tasmia has a question about audience, and I think we've got a few more that are going to be kind of about reading and audience. Tasmia, are you?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Liboiron. So my question is about audience and methodology. You have mentioned about the audience of your book in several places of the text. Like at the beginning of the text, you mentioned that this book is for both groups, settlers, indigenous, non-indigenous readers, and others besides, while also stating that this book is not written for or to everyone in the same way or even at all. So my question is, can you please elaborate, why do you think this book would not aid all readers in the same way? Or why was it important to you to extend to all groups of readers and audiences?
There's a story behind that one. The first draft of the book, I imagined the audience to be mostly white academics, because in my experience, that's what academia is. And whenever I give a talk, that's who's asking me the questions and that's who shows up. And there's a few other folks too, but largely that's who's there. And so I was anticipating those questions and those guys and women heckling me or telling me things weren't real or lived experience wasn't, you know, I was prepared. That's the audience I was writing for and defending myself against in advance. And the original draft of the book even ended in a manifesto that was a series of no's, which was like, don't steal this, don't appropriate this, don't look at me, don't touch me, don't, like all the things. So basically all of my shitty academic experiences was the main audience for the book, which statistically is who's reading the book. That's not wrong. But then the press said, who do you want to be your reviewers? And I said, well, one of them has to be an Indigenous person, otherwise there's no point to this review. And they said, great. And they got an academic auntie, an Indigenous woman who's very good at bringing people on board. And she basically said, these were not her exact words, but this is what I paraphrased. Why the fuck did you invite me into this book if you're going to tell me to screw off at the end? Like, how rude is that? Why, like, what are you doing? And this person was Candace Callison. She's now public about being this person. I didn't know who, I thought it was like a Yaqui woman at first because she was so intense. But I was like, oh my God, I am so colonized and so I have been so gaslit and so whitewashed that the only academic audience I could imagine were white people. Shame on me. Why couldn't I imagine that I'd be writing this for my own students who are not primarily white, or like my own lab or my own, you know, like, or damn, okay. So, but then I had the problem of, I had a serious methodological problem because you don't give everything, you don't give the same things to the same audiences, right? For those exact same reasons of those horrible Q&As that I get sometimes. So I had to figure out, how do I give some things and not others? So the footnotes do some of that, code switching does some of that, in jokes that not everyone will get will do some of that, anticipating some, you know, that sort of things. But I also know, like, there were certain audiences that I could not properly imagine internationally international students from certain places, Black audiences who are neither settler nor Indigenous, or Indigenous and not settler, but here against their will through slavery. Like there's all these audiences that I don't know well enough to actually write to. And I do know that predominantly white audiences constantly ask, well, what's in this for me? And why didn't you address me and my problems more? And so that's part of why I was beating the drum of like, this isn't for everyone and it might not be for you. And that was primarily for that one audience that I started writing everything for. Yeah, did that answer your question? Might be more backstory than you were looking for, but.
I love the backstory. I think that's, I mean, I want actually students to hear this backstory because this is part of the process of publishing and writing and doing our research, right? So I think, you know, what Max kind of highlights is what we all should be thinking about in terms of anytime we're producing something. And I think that you make that so visible and some of those tensions visible is what's so amazing and important. And I think we can all practice this or try to. I don't know that we can do it as well as you can, but we can practice it. Okay.
Peer review helps.
Peer review helps, yes.
Massively. I mean, standpoint theory, feminist essay, like you have the recipe, like you need more people to get on there with you.
Yeah.
And it was when Candace was like, it was so embarrassing. Like I was so embarrassed that I was, but she didn't care. And then I rewrote it and it was fine. So.
Well, and I think that also just shows the ethics and obligation of peer review, how important that process is, that practice is, and that, you know, participating in that, how important that is in terms of helping. I mean, this is an obligation. It's an obligation. And I don't know that everybody sees it that way. Some people see it as a burden, but it's clearly an obligation to make better scholars through kind of collaboration. So yeah, so that's a great backstory. Okay, and yeah, there's some folks are putting stuff in the chat. So thank you. Good, thank you, Abhinav. We may get to that about plastics. Yeah, great. Okay, we're going to get to some of these comments in the chat. So thank you so much for those folks who are putting them in. Francesca Petronio is going to talk a little bit, a short question about reader response.
So yeah, this question is very much related to the previous question, and I really appreciated like the context that you gave us. So we just read Dear Science and Other Stories in our class by Catherine McKittridge, and one of the big questions that came up was like, what is the gap between the intended audience and the people who actually end up reading the text? And specifically, like when you're doing feminist science or like anti-colonial methodology, feminist methodologies, how do you engage in a talk back with practitioners who are doing science? So I guess I was wondering, like, have you heard from anyone who is a self-identified practitioner of earth and environmental science? Do you know if your book is being read like by people doing that, and what effect has it had on them?
There's two things. One of the things I want to talk about first is this gap that Catherine McKittridge introduces in her book. So I love that book, and they came out kind of at the same time, and I was like, oh, our books are friends. And now we follow each other on Twitter, and sometimes we comment on each other's Wordle scores. So I feel like that's like my life achievement. But one of the things I love about McKittridge's book is, you know, you'll be reading a section and you're like, what? I don't understand. And you read it again and you're like, what? And then you read it again and you're like, I still don't get it. You know what? It's not for me. Moving on. Where's the part where like the white passing, you know, Indigenous person can get on board? Oh, there it is. Okay, we're on the same page again. But I really like that she doesn't do the translation for folks who don't need to, you know, and I really appreciate that tactic, which I didn't use, but deeply admire. Second part of your question, can you remind me, Frankie?
Yeah, like do you, put bluntly, do you ever hear from scientists who
Yes.
like may have read your book?
Yeah, so like most of my colleagues are actually scientists these days, and they do read the book. But the thing is, the type of scientists who will self-select to pick up a book called Pollution is Colonialism are not the ones who are going to push back against it. So there's sort of already and then the scientists who will recommend it to their other scientist friends, also self-selected. So it's circulating very well in a very small chunk of that network. I am a keynote for different like scientific conferences that are just scientists, just natural scientists, and that sort of stuff, because science is aware that it has an issue. And it's a methodological, ethical issue, or maybe they think it's just ethical and I'm trying to tell them it's methodological. But I am welcome into those spaces. And I think what's important there is that I don't speak to them like a social scientist. I don't use the word ontology when I'm talking to anyone. I think it's a rude word in general. But I feel like a lot of times I'll watch STS or humanities folks, social science folks talking to scientists, and the only option for the scientist at the end is to feel shitty. Oh, you believe in mastery of nature and you've got this view from nowhere and your entire discipline is like sexist. That gives them nowhere to go, right? But your average scientist goes into science because they want to make the world better. And they've identified the environment as like the place that needs a hand. And I think they're right. And so throwing them a bone and starting from where they are is not where I might have started on my journey, but now I fully realize that's the way to do it. And it works. It works pretty well. But yeah, good questions.
Yeah, and I'm glad the pairing of McKittrick and your book was kind of incredible. And yes, I read them both together and was so excited and thought, oh, I'm going to incorporate these both into this class because they're really talking about method in such interesting ways. They're different. They're very different. So buy them both for folks who are looking at to buy some new books.
You should buy them during the 50% off sale at Duke, which is soon. You can get both our books for $12 each, free shipping.
Yeah,
FYI.
and I mean, seriously, the pairing is so, it's exciting. So, okay, next, Maria has a sort of question about, we're getting into kind of stuff about academic conduct and rules. And I think Maria has a great question about a very specific point in your book.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
I can
Yes?
hear you. Yeah,
Okay.
you're good.
Thank you, Max, for being here today with us. So my question is quite long, so I'm going to read. So among other things, this text has once again made me rethink my relationship with academia and my own activity and production within it, in particular within the American one. So there is one part in the text that really impacted me in some way, and this is when you shared the story of Lauren Watwood, the anthropology master's student who was working in the lab, and that, according to your words, is stealing by collecting data, and that is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that she's kind of perpetuating colonialism because her presence in the lab is, for the purpose of accumulating data that belongs to other individuals who have not officially given permission to collect that data. So it seems to me that this is really related to your proposal to write and read less extractively. I think that through this work, you propose, among other things, how not to be academically extractive in order to break in some way with the colonial and imperialistic formulas within this institution in general terms, more or less. So, however, I wonder how I or we as graduate students can implement this position, since we are often, if not always, governed by specific rules of academic conduct. And how can we in some way wake up from this unconscious behavior, and how can we carry out a decolonizing practice in our academic activity or research if the academy has not yet been decolonized, even if we don't really know what that means, as you said before, the decolonization of the academy once again. So perhaps you could, if you don't mind, expand a little bit on the notion of writing and reading less extractively, since I'm really interested in this notion.
Yeah. So I think what an important lesson in specificity is you have a jurisdiction of agency and you can't do things outside of that. So graduate students and different graduate students can have more wiggle room or different wiggle room than faculty versus in the sciences versus in the social sciences. So yeah. So I'll tell you a story about someone I hired recently and the reason I hired her. So she got an interview and she was like, oh yeah, for my master's work, I was supposed to be studying, I forget what, in Taiwan. She is not from Taiwan. She is a white lady from Canada. And I was like, oh, I don't think this interview is going to go very well because like she wasn't invited. And then, and you know, she's like, oh, I was just curious. And so I was going to do this for my master's degree. But then she said, but then I thought it was a little bit not good to do that. It was a little, she used the word uncomfortable. I would use the word creepy. And so I changed my master's thesis to be about rock climbing my own community because I knew if I did anything wrong, they would tell me. And I was like, and you're hired. Like, that is exactly what you should have done. And I did hire her and she's been fantastic. So going places where you already have permission and where you know someone who is not your advisor will hold you accountable, because academia will not hold you accountable to most things, or only too thinly to like, I think really matter in a lot of cases, is really important. And so I usually and unpopularly recommend that graduate students, including PhD students, don't work with Indigenous communities or vulnerable or whatever you want to call them communities that they don't already have an existing relationship for, because first of all, it can go really sideways for them. And second of all, you don't send your junior researcher into places who are still learning and need to make their mistakes, into places where the mistakes can cause harm. And third, there's no way those folks got invited in, right? If it's not their communities. And so there's limited accountability anyway. And the work will be better and have more of a career trajectory and be more ethical if it's in a place where they already have accountability. And often that's literally just inside academia. Right? You don't have to do community-based work, and it's hard to do community-based work. And the master's degree or even a PhD is too short to be fully accountable for the trajectory of your work being thought of, created, and going out into the world. You're already gone halfway through that, and the community is left being like, how do we call them, or what happened, or why aren't they like taking our kids to the park anymore, or like whatever it was that you were doing as part of that research. So. That's a very general sort of example. The nice thing about being a graduate student is that you're expected to cite the living crap out of everything. So cite the living crap out of everything, especially, I mean, maybe not Heidegger, because I mean, he's good, but like other folks, like lots of citations. How do I know this? This person, this person, this person, this person. You can cite your professors, you can cite your classmates, you can cite, right, all this sort of stuff, I think is, because the richness of graduate stuff is your peers and your classes, and you can cite that. There's an MLA format for that. So that's the gift of graduate stuff, because at a certain point doing this kind of stuff, if you don't have due press, seems a little bit excessive, but not in graduate school. This is appropriate in graduate school.
That's awesome. Thank you, Maria, for that question. And yeah, and I think these distinctions, and again, Max, I think you kind of get at the specificity of the graduate student, right? The role of the graduate student versus some other specificity of your position in the academic hierarchy. And there is some wiggle room there. There is some possibility there to do things otherwise as well, I think. I always think.
And I think there's more than people think there are.
Yeah.
And even your advisor won't always know where all the wiggle room is. So really doing some research to find out, okay, can my grandma be on my committee? Probably, honestly, probably your grandma can be on your committee. Can't be your chair unless even if they have a PhD. Can you insert a chapter of comics? Probably you can. Can I do my bibliography by gender instead of alphabetically? Probably. I mean, it depends on your committee. It depends on your committee. So build that thing carefully. But there's a lot of wiggle room where I think people don't think it is. Yeah.
That is so helpful. I so appreciate that. And yes, we have somebody on the call who's doing a comic, basically a graphic dissertation. So, okay, and this question kind of connect. Mario, you're going to be up here. Artist practice as a way to change academia. You brought some of this up in your introductory comments, but Mario, I think you've got more to say about this. So.
Hello, thank you for being here. Yes, I want to ask something related to the connection between art and academia. You said that you thought your book as an art project. So I wanted to know, how can we, within academia, use the art, or just changing a little bit the format of the academia, which is always this, or I think, or unless, at least for me, in my as a student, I have always been told that I have to use the citation and in a certain way and in a unique way, and that I have to use a very specific format, that is the academic format, and I have to avoid using, for example, the first person singular or my subjectivity. And I think that in art, there is some kind of freedom of creating in another way. So I want to know if we can think in academic text or theoretical books as a art projects or works of art, and how can we do that within this academia so rigid, I think. So how can we face this command of being very rigid and strict with the format, knowing that the format is not only form, it is very connected to the colonization, for example, of knowledge, and how we extract knowledge of text or objects of we study. We use for example, I study literature, we use the close reading to get the meaning of the text, so we can say, I found it, and use that as a value to show to the rest of the academics or scholars. So I would like to know, how can I use art for changing that way of doing stuff in academia?
So there's a lot of responses to that question. I'm going to start with saying that I am deeply ambivalent about art. I left art for a reason. I think art is worse than science in terms of this idea that individual genius is where knowledge comes from, that desire is more important than how an audience, like your intention and your desires for your piece is more important than what the audience reads into it. There are zero ethics. Animal ethics in art are non-existent, and they're really bad. Using toxic and creating toxic materials in art, no ethics, really bad. Zero ethics for appropriation, right? So I left art because it was the Wild West in all senses of that term, in terms of obligations and ethics. And I went into science, which actually the rigidity I appreciated because there was at least a framework for ethics, even if it wasn't as good as I wanted it. At the same time, one of the gifts that doing art has brought me is when there's a problem, my toolbox is at least 7 times bigger as everyone else's. So people are like, oh, we should solve this with a lit review. I was like, or you could solve it with a pair of pantyhose, right? Because, and I have invented a thing out of pantyhose that, blah, blah, blah. So just bringing a different set of the different things that could possibly solve a problem, because you can solve it materially and in practice, and that's a given if you have an art background, in a way that sometimes you have to develop if you just have the writerly academic background and training. So that's really valuable. I think that opening up the rigidity science can be done with art. I think it can be done with science. I think it can be done with economics. And it's really all about you can do all of those things with better land relations. You can do all of those things with better obligation. And in some cases, doing it with science and economics is easier because you can fly under the radar. In some ways, doing an art is better because maybe you need to disrupt something. So I think it always comes down to specificity, not shockingly. What tool is going to get, or what set of tools might get this job done best? And if you have art as one of the things that you can draw on, but also science and also economics, you're in a better position to deal with it, I think. That isn't a specific answer to your question. But again, I also think academia has more wiggle room than we think it does. Again, the wiggle room becomes more and more apparent the more secure your position is. But yeah, I think like if people aren't letting you write in the first person, change your advisor, because even in science, you can write in the first person. There's a I just did a thing on a biology student as an outside reader, first person. In the field, we fell in the mud. That's when I learned. You're like, yeah, great methodology section. Yeah, so I think it's about finding your team and finding the most fertile space to do stuff, even if it's only a tiny bit more fertile than the place just to the left. Yeah.
I love it, finding your team. And we were talking about the kind of conservative, when we were reading and discussing McKittrick's work about the conservatism of the academy, the hierarchies, that it's a very conservative institution. And I did kind of say, and the humanists are the most invested in the or they are many are very invested in the hierarchies. And it may not be that the scientists are. So we can't sort of generalize, I think, about people's approaches. But I also saw on Twitter the pantyhose. So that was how was that used again? How did you use the pantyhose to collect plastic?
Yes, so when I first moved here, I didn't have any grant money, but I wanted to skim the surface of water for microplastics, which are very small. And so I got a pair of baby pantyhose, and I do not know why I had those in my house. I do not have a baby. And I put it over a soda pop bottle with the bottom and the top cut out and just skimmed it over the top of the water in a sewage outflow and caught a bunch. And that became the basis for now an open source prototype, or it's no longer a prototype, it's now an open source technology for low cost. It's called trawling, fancy net, but like baby pantyhose work. So do adult pantyhose, but they get really heavy and they're not pink.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you for that. And I see people we're going to get to you guys in the chat, I promise. We've just got a few more students and I want to give them a chance to ask. So Carl, the next two are also kind of related to arts, the arts and humanities. And then we'll get a question or two about science more specifically, but go ahead, Carl.
Yeah. I'll echo what everyone else has said. Thank you for coming. The book was awesome. It was great to read. Glad you're here. And I have a broad question that you've, I think, answered in many ways, but I'm still going to ask it just to ask, so that you lay out some specific scientific practices in your book. And I'm curious about how you envision these practices beyond science. So how do you envision place-based research methodologies in the arts and humanities? Or to put my question another way, how do you envision the breakdown of disciplinary boundaries in an anti-colonial way?
So there's a great book by Eve Tuck, and I forget her first name, Mackenzie, called Place-Based Research. That's really for the social sciences and to some extent for what they imagine the arts to be. And yeah, you start from a place and your research question is like, what matters here? So you just listen to what people are talking about, what they have issues with, and that is your topic. And then you say, what do you need and how do you need it? And they will tell, so it's places people, as well as other sort of material things. But the people, especially the people who live there and have lived there for a long time, will be able to surface the way that materiality matters in that place and do that for you. So it's not a coincidence that I started working on cod here, because cod is what matters, at least in this part of the island. Char matters and caribou matters further north. But like cod is the thing, we have the highest fish, like people who fish rate, including urban people in Canada outside of the territories. So, and they catch cod. So other like folks will tell you, basically. You don't have to figure it out yourself. That's the good news. Folks will tell you if you listen. And you can do that in any discipline that's not disciplinary specific. And I don't have a good question about disciplines. I'm not disciplined. I have failed to discipline. I keep changing my discipline, and the disadvantage is you have to read a lot. But the advantage is that, again, you come to problems and you're like, what will bear on this problem? Is science better? Is art better? Is a combination better? What kind of collaborators do I need to bring to the table and what skills should they have? So I always think you start with a problem and then you figure out what tools best solve that problem rather than wandering around with a hammer, wondering what you can whack.
Sometimes whacking's okay though too.
Oh, sometimes you gotta whack a nail and literally then you get the, like totally, definitely. But I don't think it's set out in advance. Like I don't think a problem automatically comes with a discipline that's best. And it's actually something you have to consider.
Yeah, and
economics are not always best solved by economists, for
if
instance.
that's the choice, and I think that was intentional to say undisciplined, not interdisciplined, or the undisciplined, the kind of outside of or trying to not be beholden. Would you say that's how you approach this? Yeah.
I'm highly professionalized, but not disciplined in a discipline. Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction.
I like that. So you would, something you're interested in or sort of would communicate is that professionalization is important.
It's important so you can get all the money.
Yeah.
So this hasn't come up yet, but sometimes people are like, well, why are you in academia instead of doing something else? Well, first of all, the pension. Well, actually, mostly the pension. Like, this is a sweet freaking gig. And the second it's not a sweet gig or the compromises are too great, I'll be either a sanitation worker or a dog trainer. Those are like actually on the table, and I have certifications for both just in case. So, so being able to circulate and passing and grifting is a huge part of my material world and ethics and this sort of stuff. Like circulating so you can get the grant money and train the students and get the Indigenous folks their PhDs and their law degrees and whatever, so they can go, like all of that is part of the sweet deal. And so that requires professionalization. You can't flip the table on your first day. In fact, if you slowly steal parts of the table and build 10 of them somewhere else and no one notices that they're on like a very different table by the end of it, that's not the only method to do it, but that is my preferred method. And so being able to pass in professional spaces through professionalization, I think is, I mean, it's a hustle. We all know how to hustle. Yeah. And recognizing it as a hustle and therefore like, oh, I don't belong here. No shit, you don't belong here. You're here to steal the silverware. That is, and return it to the miners is like yeah, I think is the point of academia.
That's wonderful. I saw Joseph Pierce kind of give a heart for that. Yeah, I mean, how we do this, how we manage these spaces and take from them. Thievery is helpful. Okay, Kaylin, more on art and science as a practice. Kaylin.
Thank you very much for being here with us. And I really enjoyed so much and felt, always challenged by the modes of address that you used in your book. And I appreciated a lot how direct and clear they were. And also, in some cases, how intimate they were, and your care with citations and acknowledgements and the problems of we and the distinctions between universalism and generalization, and the story of the scoop and the impossibility of scooping a quadrant of sand from a rocky coastline. But I come from art history and I come from working as a critic, and I was really interested to see your image on the cover and photographs that you took in the book, and to know that you had an art practice. And you have mainly answered this question already, but I guess just to push it a little bit further is I wanted to know, because there are also within art, which is, I agree with everything that you said about the lack of ethics, but there are histories of making and art histories that are outside of the mainstream that have different ethical dynamics. But there are huge separations between art and science. And I actually wondered if you saw your art practice and your science as the same, or could they be?
I don't think about it because I don't care. So like if my art practice involves me knowing how to mix oily things together, then I use it in science all the time. And if science involves me being able to visually differentiate between plastics and non-plastics because of cellular specific structures, then I do art all the time when I'm doing science, because the visual identification, like that's, So again, like, what's the problem and what's the most useful thing? Right now, I do a lot of science because circulates really well in the halls of power. It's a really good way to get Indigenous youth a lot of money as like science apprentices. In a way, I couldn't get them as art apprentices or something like that. So I'll keep beating the science drum and doing whatever, as long as it passes for science and which is answered by other people, not me, then we're good to go. And I don't care whether we're doing art or science. There's like this chunk of a science grant I just put in where we're going to get young people to illustrate, like it's an Inuit community, like Inuit youth to illustrate the science. And it was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, yeah, I'm going to give them $1,000 to draw. Cool. But I also know how to like choose between two pieces of art. And because I have an art degree, they're like, oh yeah, you can do that. Great. Okay. So I think it's really just like ponying up what gets the resources where they need to go, gets the citations and the attention where they need to go. And curation is, that's the curator's job. That's your job. This Footnotes is your job. So that's cool. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. No, and I think you're really, the pragmatics of it are amazing to me. I mean, I'm not surprised. I've known you for a while and I saw this before. This was your sort of approach, but this sort of just pragmatic, not getting kind of caught in, I mean, the pragmatics make it, your decisions are kind of ethical in their sort of pragmatic approach, I think.
You're heavily pragmatic. I mean, I took your course and I got the certificate in whatever cultural studies because people weren't taking this artist seriously. And so I needed a certificate from university. So like, off I go, I'm going to take these courses, la, la, la. And then, and then that helped me apply for a PhD. So, I mean, I'm not curiosity driven. I'm like pension and paycheck driven. And not just for me, but for extended networks. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, great. Okay. A very explicit science question now. Whoa.
Hello, Dr. Liboiron. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for being here. And my question is about practices of non-dominant science in its relation to our everyday life. So I think the multiplicity of science is one of the very important issues of your book. And I think this is also the most significant issue of our world. And I think one of the reasons of this, climate crisis is based on a single science system or a single discourse about the science. So, for example, many world governments worldwide are depending on a single dominant discourse about climate change, like carbon neutrality. But we are also seeing its limit now. So I think we need to develop or discover other multiple sciences, as you wrote up in your book. And I think it is not only academic, but located at our mundane practices. So my question is whether you think that this climate crisis can be solved by a multiplicity of sciences. And I also want to ask you that if non-dominant science is essential to counter the universalization of dominant science, how we can practice it in our everyday life, not only in academia.
That's a pretty big question. Please solve the greatest issue facing the world. Thank you, in 5 minutes or less. The good news is I don't think science will have any impact on climate change whatsoever, because we really already know what the problem is. You need to keep oil in the ground, and that's the full list. And you need to transition out of oil and gas, natural gas, carbon-based energy systems ASAP. We already know that. We actually don't need dominant or any other kind of science to tell us, because dominant and other kinds of science have really been telling us for quite some time. So I feel things like the Russian-Ukraine war, the energy crisis of the 1970s, those have way more capacity to impact the climate crisis than science. Because, I mean, yeah. Sometimes in interviews, I show this graph of plastic production since 1945. It existed before then, but that's when I started getting track. And there's plastic production goes, it's very similar to climate change and carbon production and global warming. And there's this moment where the graph goes down, and then another moment where it goes down. And the first one is the energy crisis of the 1970s, where we couldn't get oil from various parts of overseas. And And the second one is the recession from the 2010s or 2000s, early 2000s. And so that's what will actually impact plastics, which is the same feedstock as oil and gas, which is the same driver of climate change. So economic, global circulation of feedstocks, right? The ability of imperial powers to access their hinterlands, that's what matters. So I'm really looking forward to what the Ukraine-US or Russian war does for this, because I think that's the biggest wiggle in both climate change and plastics, because again, same feedstock. And that's the direction things will go in. Yeah, the other thing is, we don't have to discover alternative science. They are everywhere. Midwifery is an alternative, non-dominant science, right? You don't even have to go outside of Western traditions. And they're being practiced all the time, everywhere, inside of dominant science, alongside it, and also at home. So the good news is that they're already everywhere, and it's just really power dynamics and what gets funding and what counts as legit in certain circles. That's what matters. So we don't need new ones. It's the power dynamic, which is not a scientific problem. Yeah.
Great. That's a huge question. Well, great question. And
yeah, good job.
Great answer. You did it.
It is the thing.
Okay, we've got one more student question, then I'm going to go into the chat because I see the folks in the chat. Galia on land.
Hi, Max, and thanks for being here and like all the amazing like answers have been like mind-blowing. Like they feel very familiar, which is always good. So my question is like a very simple question, and it's just gonna ask you about a backstory. So I really like the distinction between land with capital L and non-capital L, and like the way in which you use it throughout the book. So kind of how was the intimate, because like the intimate were like very present in your book. So how was like the intimate process of arriving to that distinction and like playing, like, yeah, using that distinction in your book? So very simple question about a backstory.
Well, I think it came from a discussion with my cousin, Emily Simmons, who is like she's way more in community than I am, way more. And I forget what we were talking about, but she said something like, well, you know, the same land can be different things to different people, and that's still good. And I was like, oh, okay, shoot, okay. So trying to figure out how to put that on the page, I couldn't figure it out, because one set of relations can be known by people from very different whatevers in good ways and not the same way. So I was like, how do I put that down whenever I say land when I pass by? Because I don't want to do this thing where like land is only reserved for Indigenous people, because not all Indigenous people and not all land and etc. So then I came to the L/L and I was like, oh my God, I look like a 1990s feminist. I hate that writing with the parentheses in the middle of the word and but I couldn't think of another way to do it. So I just left a footnote being like, yep, it looks kind of nasty. Moving on. I couldn't figure out another way to do it. So that's the split. And that was in the second version, where I was really thinking about like, how do you make space for settler folks who have good land relations, who have healthy land relations with the land itself, who are caring for it, who are doing anti-colonial work, or at least not reproducing colonialism. How do I make space for them? And that was one of the answers, was the /capital, even though it's kind of ugly, it's super ugly. I really dislike it.
Well, it also disrupts your reading of it, which is helpful. The kind of interruption of, so even at some point I was quoting you and I felt I had to say land, capital L/L. So how you read that, it complicates it and interrupts it. I don't know if it seems like a good thing to me.
It also, yes. However, when you say that and someone hasn't read the book, or when it appears in a review, it looks so fucking elitist, because it looks like 1990s, like white academic feminism. And so that part drove me a little bit, but you know, compromise, what you're gonna do. That's what I did, it's fine. Also, like, you don't have to love everything and it's still the best idea. Like, you know.
Well, and also one thing I learned, and also that I think you do really well, is you say these things change, like how I would write this now this is where I stand now, and I'm using this, but it might change. And I think that's very freeing to kind of note that. It's good for the students to hear that you're not stuck. If you use something now, you're not stuck committed to that forever. You can disavow that. You can say that's not right anymore, or it doesn't work for me. Okay,
Sometimes
let's
people-
go ahead. Oh, go
Sometimes
ahead.
people write me and they say, oh, I just read The Matter with Plastics. And I'm like, well, that's too bad. Here's what you should have read. Sorry about that. I can't unpublish that. It's fine, whatever.
Unpublishing. We're all going to start unpublishing. Okay, I'm going to the chat now because we do have some time here. So Na Young, are you here? Do you want to? And this kind of works. This is about parentheses. Are you here, Na Young?
Education and teaching.
Maybe not. Okay, yeah, go ahead and ask that because that kind of fits with the last question in a way.
Right. So I mean, you told us, like, you just told us that you didn't like how like parentheses worked, but I actually liked it a lot. So I was wondering, I have had a question on the role of intellectuals and education in terms of anti-colonialism, because you're, I guess, like, at some point I was wondering, as an academic, we are not only like researching, but we're also like teaching, and there are like several different roles and meanings or significance of being an academic. So I was wondering, and especially when we're trying to not reproduce the colonial approach to science or any type of research or study, I was wondering, like, if you're living in the world where, like, in the world of where, like, political nexus, like, if you're in the middle of the nexus of different politics, how can we, like, is there even a thing that could be called like agency? And if we could blame this, I was wondering, like, where could we, like, where is the point? How can we, where is this ground where we could, get out of that structure or system? So I was wondering how could we think of our role as intellectuals when it comes to teaching and education?
Yeah, so that's another really big, broad question. I think you always have some amount of agency, even if it's very small. There's a story my godfather tells about his mom who was at residential school, and those were very brutal. But during her several years there, she became best friends with a tree, and it was her only friend. And whenever I'm like, there's nothing I can possibly do, there's nothing good, I'm like, okay. She made friends with a tree when there were less than 0 options. So, like, and need a best friend. So, like, I can scrap it together and do at least that, if not better. So I think even in something like academia and rigid things, you do have agency. And I can tell you one of the things that I've done fairly recently that has really changed my pedagogical space. And that's get rid of any practices that are based on scarcity. So too many A's, deadlines for assignments, coming in late, having to have done the readings. You can run a class just fine without any of those things. I use something called contract grading, where people know what the grade they're going to get at the outset, because everything is pass fail, and there's different lists of things they do to get different grades. And so that gets rid of that stress and that, so I feel like scarcity narratives are really foundational to colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and it's shared across things. And it's a primary reproduction in pedagogy in a way that it really doesn't have to be. Me not knowing things, me being underprepared for class and telling people, me, like this sort of stuff is, in certain ways. Yeah, and I gotta tell you, they're better classes for me too. So I think part of what my book tries to do, and I haven't done this systematically in pedagogy, but a lot of Eve Tuck's work, she's in an education department. There, Wayne Yang, he does this. Lots of very smart people do this. Look, just thinking through all the things that seem very normal or necessary in education and being like, actually, it's not, and also very colonial. Yes, that's actually no, and that's actually very capitalist, and oh, actually no, and there's a fair bit of wiggle room. I hand in grades at the end, and I hand in my syllabus like I'm supposed to, and it's all good.
That's amazing. Yeah, scarcity is a scam. I mean,
it is.
yes.
Even when there's not a lot, it's still not. There's still not usually scarcity as it's usually manufactured in certain ways.
Yes.
And you can walk that back almost always. Maybe not all the way where like everyone gets a pony, but some other way. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, we have a few questions from folks here at Stony Brook. Abena, who is one of the organizers of the waste crisis event that's coming up. So Abena, you want to come on and talk us through your question or your comment?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing so openly and freely with our students. I've really appreciated it. I just had a small question about plastics. I really loved the way you talked about the possibility of plastics within the book, particularly the way it could push us past a few of these kind of axioms about thresholds, right? And I think that struck me now because that definitely relates to just some of the work that I'm involved in around waste within this area, in which our discussions about thresholds and how those have been used to kind of insulate toxic industries from actually being accountable. Even that discussion feels like a slap in the face for folks that live there, that like we have to test and prove that like this is the amount as opposed to that. And so I was just interested to hear stories about the ways in which a different conversation about thresholds, that the type of conversation that you introduce in the book is being had at the EPA or at the DEC or at other types of spaces. Thank you.
So I can't tell you anything about the EPA, but I think Chris Sellers is here, who probably can, because that's his bag. Also, it's not my country anymore. So, but I can tell you how. So Nunatsiavut government is the main government I work for, and we measure plastics and count them and have that sort of stuff. But we don't do threshold stuff. We use consent models. So we did not consent to have any plastics here. We did not consent to have these types of plastics here. We did not consent to have plastics here. And it usually has to do with food webs, which means we can then leverage it right into Indigenous food sovereignty and the UN declarations of the rights of Indigenous people. And so we've found more other ways to talk about the violence of pollution without always going to thresholds as the only or primary way to articulate harm. Because as you know, otherwise you end up on that threshold of like having to measure and remeasure and prove your measures and prove that the measures they have is wrong and like just skip it and not see if it goes to consent and sovereignty. They would call it sovereignty. So yeah, and so that's why there's a whole chapter dedicated to like the difference between harm and violence, because there's different ways to talk about even like the violence of consultation and like what a racket that is. Like even sometimes that's the process that people talk about, being like your consultation is flawed, therefore you can't build, therefore you have to leave, therefore you have to be accountable to this, therefore, and that gets used in different ways here too. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
That is extremely helpful. Thank you.
And Abena, and talk about specificity, right? I mean, you're looking here at Long Island and these issues on Long Island, so it's really cool.
Liz Hoover's work might be really helpful there, because Liz Hoover's work on contaminants in Cancer Alley is really good on these sorts of points. Yeah.
And you mentioned Chris Sellers, and Chris has a question in the chat. Chris, I didn't see you are you still here?
I am.
Hi, Chris.
Hey. Hey, look, Avena, it sounds like we have a nice chat. We should sometime. So Max, great to see you here. Great to have you. I didn't realize the Stony Brook connection, but I think those of us working in the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, you have a fan club there. So just, we're following your work and your example with great interest. My question had to do with this community we've been working with, or I've been working with them for quite a while, and now Edgy is working with them in Port Arthur, Texas, site of the biggest oil refinery now in North America. And, I'm thinking about this pollution is colonialism, and that, you're very clear about the specificity of that sort of project you lay out in your book, but I'm wondering how you would how it applies, or you would revise it to address their situation, which seems to me it's a little bit, you would have to do some tailoring, I guess, according to the place to make that make it more place-based. But so the big presence there, the three of the nation's biggest oil refineries, an African-American community that is sort of nestled right up against these refineries and has had all these struggles to get the pollution, fence line pollution regulated. And so, the corporation is there, these big corporations, the lack of a state, actually it's the de-statification of this community that is part of the problem, I think, as they see it. And then, and it's also from this whole legacy, which is a little different from the indigenous history legacy, which is things like segregation, racial segregation, redlining, and these kinds of forces and legacies that have put them there and sort of trapped them there. What message would you have for this community? I struggle with this. I want to, the anti-colonialism, I get that and sort of really, and am on board with that, but having a little trouble fitting it to this community, this kind of dilemma, which is actually, in the environmental justice dilemma in a lot of places. So I just, what do you say?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know them, but I would start with the conversation of what they care about and what's going on there, because Black folks' bodies have been used as a sink for colonial desires forever. Like that's proto-colonialism. So being stolen from land and used as a sink is not terribly different than stealing land and using it as a sink, or dispossessing Indigenous people and using the land as a sink. But whether that matters, whether that's the relationship that matters or something else, that would be up to them. So, it sounds like you have a pretty classic distributive justice fence line sort of thing, and that's a very well-studied sort of area, and the dynamics of that are fairly well studied, and science is not usually the answer. Like Louisiana Bucket Brigade aside, it's usually other avenues that are outside of science, because they already will know through their bodies and through their interactions with the lands exactly what the problems are, and you can just skip the science part, right? The other thing that might be useful is M. Murphy and Anaswane's the pollution app. So they're really good at using colonial industrial data against colonial industrial data producers in terms of pollution. So using compromised, really bad data against the industry's own data against itself. And I'm not privy to all the details of that, because it is a community-based project and it doesn't tend to circulate beyond the community, but they appear to be doing really good enough things that a lot of people are getting arrested, if that's the metric that matters, which I think in their case it is.
What's the group again?
Yeah. M. Murphy and the Technoscience Research Unit out of Toronto.
Oh, Michelle, yes. Okay, Michelle.
Yeah, and Vanessa Gray.
Okay.
Those folks.
Yes. Yeah.
So they've got some sophistication going there in an identical situation. Yeah, or close to identical in situation.
Cool.
Thank you, Max. Yeah, I was struck by how assimilative capacity, I can't even say the word, but works across scales. I mean, that's one of the things you really point to. It's about bodies, it's about land, and making it okay to poison bodies, for example, along with land. So yeah. We have time for one more question, and then we'll let you go, because I think you've worked hard.
Dinner time.
You did so amazing. And Joseph Pierce has a last comment question. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, I know you on Twitter.
Yeah, Max, it's good to see you.
You too. I've never seen you in 3D before.
I think the question is about seeing. I think seeing and being seen, and about embodying and being in good relations in place, because one of the things that you probably know first in the flesh is how institutions will attempt to sort of create an idea of themselves based on disciplinary diversity, bodily diversity, engagement with things like upward mobility becomes a key word at Stony Brook recently. And yet at the same time, we'll propose things like this environmental hub on Governor's Island without any consultation or engagement with even the thought that that might be problematic regarding Indigenous peoples and land itself. So there's a very large, the task is Sisyphean here, as it is everywhere. So the question is sort of about how to sustain the engagement with the institutions that want to kill you, how to sustain engagement while at the same time understanding that our bodies and our presence complicates some of these narratives of mobility, upward mobility, or of diversity and inclusion. We may be included physically, but we're also not included epistemologically or ontologically, if we can turn to that. So it's more of a question about how to be here in good relations in an ethical way, when those ethics are never ever considered as part of an ongoing praxis, research praxis, and how to sustain that type of those types of commitments of care.
So there's a lot to that question. First of all, if someone's trying to kill you, you shouldn't walk up and make friends with them. You should leave or like hide or something like that. And that's also true of universities. So I think it's crucial. And Rick, one of my godfather taught me this a lot, is like, warriors, you have to like lay down your weapons and beat it sometimes. That is integral to being a warrior, especially if you're going to do this for a long time and not be one of those like cannon fodder type warriors that just get killed in the front and then counted up. So leaving and getting out, temporary, like taking breaks. I don't mean leaving the institution, although that's also sometimes very viable. But taking breaks and not engaging, I think, is the super important. Refusal to take it up is very important and not a failure. So I'll say that first. The second thing is that some of those lessons became most obvious to me when I became an administrator. So I became the asshole university who is doing these things. And for the first time, I had sticks and carrots. Like I was the most impactful activism I have ever done in my life is as a university administrator, because I had control, like actual control over administrative infrastructure. And I was the associate vice president of research. So second in charge of the entire university's research infrastructure, from animal care to contracts to the human ethics, everything research, grants, ethic. And so in that time, I put in a policy for Indigenous consent, where you can't do research on, with, or whatever on Indigenous people or land without them saying yes first before you get the grant. And I put in an Indigenous data sovereignty contract which meant that Indigenous people owned the data about themselves and not the PI, not the principal investigator. And then I got the hell out of there. And now I'm hiding as a faculty member in my cave until people are much less angry at me and I don't get assaulted in the grocery store. And both of those moves were important. And over that time, I think I found the university isn't going to change. And so instead of trying to decolonize the university, you can use it as an engine of decolonization, regardless of the other imperial bullshit it gets up to. It like is unaware. The right hand and the left hand of the university are not talking to each other. They do not know where all their money is. They do not know which rooms are available. And so you can figure that out and put it in the direction it needs to go into. And very few people need to know that you're doing that, right? So La Peterson has this great book called A Third University is Possible that talks about how like the university is quite unfaithful to itself in terms of colonial impulses, as well as being a definite colonial engine. And I found that to be the most useful theory of change when it came to those exact questions that you're asking. In the engine of erasure and like Indigenous death, how do you steal the land? Oh, well, there are ways, right? So yeah, it'll be different in different places, but yeah. And just don't do it all yourself. If you're by yourself, get out. And if it takes 10 years for someone else to come, and that someone else doesn't have to be always an Indigenous person. Although in my case, there was a bunch of us Indigenous administrators at once, and now almost all of us are gone, mostly to different jobs. But if you're standing by yourself in a war zone, get the fuck out and go somewhere else until you can't do it by yourself. Yeah. So yeah. So there are others that they might not be at Shinnecock Nation is like, just go to the golf course and go see Shinnecock folks, or, New York City is right there. There's different coalitions you can build if there's not others at SUNY Stony Brook. Also there are Black folks. Also, there are folks in a similar space, even if they're not the same. And yeah, call me.
I think, wow. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Max. I think that's a great thing to finish on. Stealing and also running and hiding sometimes. I think this is really good advice for all of us. I want to just say, I'm so grateful for you, Max. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom. The book, everyone, please buy the book, read the book. It's amazing. There's so many, you can sense the nuggets in it. There's so much there. But thank you for joining us. I want to just really shout out to my students for great questions and really thoughtful conversation. And thanks to everybody who's here and from elsewhere coming and joining us, because I really appreciate it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Max.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for showing up. That was super cool.